Hey everyone, welcome back to Learn Easy. Today we're going to dive into the second part of our ATM project, where we'll explore some fundamental principles and patterns that can help us reach our goal of making this program cleaner and more maintainable. In front of us, we have a piece of code that manages ATM transactions. It's functional, but it can certainly benefit from some structural improvement to make it more efficient and better organized. So, how do we go about doing that? Well, we'll leverage three powerful concepts that we're going to talk about today. The facade design pattern. A facade is an object that serves as a front-facing interface, masking more complex underlying or structural code. In our program, we can implement the design pattern to tie it all together. By introducing the design pattern called the facade, we'll be able to provide a simplified and unified interface to a complex system. In our case, it will be a gateway to an ATM transaction process, hiding the underlying complexity and making our code more user-friendly. Secondly, we're going to introduce the single responsibility principle, which states every class, model, or function in a program should have one responsibility/purpose in a program. For our program, we can implement the single responsibility principle, which, for our case, we could create a class that should only have one reason to change in the priority code. And we'll identify the areas where responsibilities are mixed and refactor them into separate classes, creating a single responsibility and following one of the solid principle guidelines into making our project more stable. Lastly, we're going to implement encapsulation. It involves bundling data, variables, and the functions methods that operate on the data into a single unit called a class. For our program, we'll introduce encapsulation, a specific functionality within classes, ensuring that the implementation details are hidden from the outside world, which will make our code cleaner and less error-prone. So as we embark in this coding journey, our goal is to transform this somewhat tangled code into a well-structured and modular system, making it easier to maintain, understand, and even extend. So guys, sit back, relax, and let's get started. If you enjoyed the video and would like to support the channel, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you guys. Alright guys, so let's hop into the code. Firstly, as we see here, this was our previous program that we created before on our last video. Here we have different implementations and functions and mixed into one specific file. We can first create a new main function, and we're going to name it main. Okay, so in this main function, what we want is to have our main function, which will operate and run only a specific function. Here we're going to implement and instantiate the ATM machine object, which we're going to later on create. First, let's say ATM machine is equal to ATM machine. This will be the object, and we're going to reference it and store it into the ATM machine variable. And we're going to say ATM machine. We're going to call start on it, which will be a future function that we're going to be within the ATM machine. So now let's create our ATM machine object. So let's name it ATM machine, just like we had it above. We're going to implement three functions. One, which we stated here below, start. So let's do that first by calling start. Calling it start, and within start we're going to have two functions which we previously had in our old code. These two functions are welcome client and selection transaction. So what we can do, since we already have this code, we can just reuse it. First, by copying the welcome client below the start. We can delete this selection transaction function, and for now we can leave it like this. As mentioned before, we're going to have three functions. First we have our start, second our welcome client, and lastly process transaction, which can be seen here. Here's called selection transaction, but we're going to rename it. and call it process transaction. Okay, so now we have our three main functions. Our welcome client, I decided that we could add a new printline function. And within this printline function, why don't we just add this code right here? We just integrate it into this welcome client, removing extra functionality and making it our code more concise. So now we can replace that selection transaction with a new function. Process transaction. We're going to create our ATM facade. This is where Facade comes into play. We're going to use it to hide the complexity of our object and use a simple class to obtain and integrate with that class. So by first, we can create a variable ATM facade. We're going to say ATM transaction. ATM transaction facade. Don't red because we haven't created it yet, but we're going to create it on in the future. So now in our start, we can call our welcome client function that we had below and call our process transaction. Now let's get into creating the ATM transaction facade object. So let's create our ATM facade object. So in this class, we're going to create three variables: var deposit, transaction, and we're going to create a separate class for this one, which is going to be called deposit transaction. So we're going to create the withdrawal transaction variable. Later on, we're going to create these objects. Retrieval. Transaction. Okay, so below, what we're going to do is use an init to initialize our values for our objects. We're going to say deposit transaction is going to be equal to deposit transaction, which is an object that we're going to later on create. Same thing with withdrawal transaction, and we're going to set it up to withdrawal transaction object. And we can do the same for balance retrieval. Okay, so let's look back at our code, our previous code. And here we had an enum class, transaction options, which contain three main constants: balance, withdrawal, and deposit. So let's bring this class into our ATM transaction facade, and we're going to add it below the initializer. Okay, now we have our ATM transaction options. Here below the main, we had a transaction process function, and inside we had a when, which we use input from the user. So let's copy this code here and let's add it below our enum class. Okay, so now here we're getting some red errors, right? So let's take out these two functions for now. Let's delete them. Okay. So now how could we go about this? So before I mentioned that we're going to create three objects: deposit transaction, withdrawal transaction, and balance retrieval transaction. So now let's go on about that. Let's start by creating our deposit transaction class. Okay, so let's continue. So in deposit transaction, let's look back at what we had. So we could first start by, let's get a hold of our account balance and just add it into our deposit transaction below here. Okay, so now we have that. Remember when we created in our ATM facade, we created a transaction process function. So this is where the facade comes in, allowing to hide complexity and allowing us to access a complex object. Alright, so that's it for the first part. We implemented the facade design pattern and were able to hide the complexity of an object, while having an easy way to access its complex system design. Stay tuned for the second part, where we'll implement single responsibility principle and encapsulation into our design. Remember guys, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. See you guys in the next video.